Well, good morning if you are in Seattle, Washington, or Santiago, Chile. Good afternoon if you're in New York City, or Atlanta, or Miami, or Rio de Janeiro. Good evening if you are in Rovereto, or in Trento, or in any town in the Trentino region of Italy, which we will be discussing a lot today. Greetings to people all over Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and all around the world where people listen to Adagio. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. My guest today is a gentleman whose work I know, but unless I'm wrong, we've never exchanged conversation at all. We've seen each other online a lot, but we somehow our paths have not crossed professionally. Mitchell Piper, is an artist manager of long standing and of great renown who represents many artists who I like and respect. And he's also executive director of a very special music festival, something I care about a great deal that I'd like to talk to him about that. But Mitch, welcome.
Thank you, Fred. I'm happy to be here.
If I cough, I have asthma. That's it. How did you start in music and in music management specifically?
Oh gosh, I was a music major in college, voice performance. Did what most young singers did. At the time I graduated, moved back to New York, where it was seen you needed to be to get auditions and to help get careers started. And I very quickly, I was a tenor, very quickly moved to Europe, lived in Germany for a while. And when we moved, I met my wife, Robin Blowers, who's a wonderful coloratura soprano at the time. And when we moved back to the United States, we wanted to do something to help young singers. And so we started a foundation to raise money and to give money to and to support young singers. And at the time, I had a donor that was helping us with this. And we had a wonderful competition that we were doing. We were giving away $100,000 a year back in the early 2000s, which was a lot of money back then to give away to young singers. And we also had this festival that we had started in the year 2000. And the donor said to me, he said, what would you like to do next? And I said, well, we have a festival that we're training singers. We have competition to help give money to singers, but that's not always enough to get young singers started. And I said, I'd like to have a management company. And so we put our heads together. We both put some money in the pot, as they say, and we bought a management company. And at the time, we quickly sort of made our mission to help young singers. So we had a lot of really established singers in the company at that time, but we didn't have a lot of young singers. So I took it upon myself to really try to propel young careers, people coming out of AVA, Juilliard, Curtis, other places, and sort of made that our mission to try to have it as a launching pad for young careers. And that was in 2005. So this is our 20th year in the management company. And it's been a real joy.
Have you kept on some of the older artists? Some retire, but did it become really a company full of young artists, or is it a mix?
It was definitely a mix. And when I say young artists, I don't mean young artists in the form of like a young artist program. I just meant younger singers that were, starting in their careers. And then we have always kept a lot of really established singers. We also took on a lot of singers whose careers were starting to slow down. but we felt that they shouldn't be ending.
Mhm.
Uh, one singer at the Metropolitan Opera asked me, she said, I'm not getting hired as Dalila on these things any longer. And I said, but you've got an amazing voice. And so maybe if we talked about some repertoire changes, we could extend that career. And we did. And so we worked with a lot of established singers as well. And so it's a real mix of what we have today.
Here's a question I've never asked of a proprietor of a management company that I should have asked maybe 30 years ago. When you have a group of artists of different ages and experiences who are in some ways competing for the same roles, but that's really not my question. Do you use the older artist to mentor and guide the younger artist? Is that part of the mix, or do you manage each person individually? Um, yeah, because basically, I would always like to see older artists work with and mentor younger artists, maybe pass on their knowledge and their experience in a role. If someone's not singing Dalila anymore, she might find a younger mentor who might be just starting with that role.
I have done that. I mean, I think you have to approach each singer individually. Their individual talents, they have individual desires. Some want to be the next Pavarotti, others want to be working singers in a fest contract. They want to have a family and have a more of a normal life. So maybe Germany is the place for them on a yearly contract. But as far as mentoring, I think it is important having approached the business as a former singer, I always sought out people to sing roles with. When I was first singing Bacchus, I went to James King and ask him if I could sing it for him. And so I felt like that was important, that knowledge. And so when I would have a young tenor that I would put on the roster, I would say to that tenor, why don't we get a session over at what used to be called NOLA back in those days, and have you sing through this butterfly before you go there for him, because he's sung it all over the world. And I found that the older singers were extremely generous of their time and willing, to help the young ones like that.
So regular listeners to my program know that I often ask my guests to identify in the Adagio catalog music or musicians whom they like very much. And you wrote to me, I loved James King and his Lohengrin, Siegmund, and Parsifal are, in my opinion, the finest available. Now, people who love Wagnerian and heroic Helden opera in the German language mostly can name names like Birgit Nielsen and Leonie Rieseneck and Eva Martone and Astrid Varnay and a few others, Loritz Melchior. But I think someone who's been lost in the shuffle a bit, and maybe because he has such a common name, James King, it's not like saying Loritz Melchior, where
Right.
there's only one of those. But sentence Van Holm, or names where we really have to
Right.
apply ourselves to say it. James King, there are many James Kings in the world. I heard James King sing. I found him a wonderful man when I dealt with him backstage, but I've never had the opportunity to converse with anyone about James King. So let's talk about him.
Good. I'm happy to.
Go right
We
ahead.
we were we grew up about 60 miles from each other. He was a couple of generations older than I was, but we were both young tenors from Kansas when we started out. And so I had always known of the name because it's not often that someone from a small town in Kansas becomes one of the world's greatest Helden tenors. And my teachers at the time, I was studying at Indiana with a woman that you'll know the name, named Margaret Harshaw.
Sure.
And James King had just started on the faculty. And so I approached him and I told him where I grew up, and he is an extremely nice man. And I remember sitting in his office for an hour and a half just talking about Kansas and growing up and what it was like, and singing in church choir and doing solos at weddings and funerals and the things you do in small towns. And we just then years later, when we had our competition, I named one of the prizes the James King Award. And so we had kept up conversations over the years, mainly when I was at Indiana, but then a few times after that as well. And I so admired his singing. It was the first time I heard him live, I was two singers had impressed me with just the sheer volume, not only the volume, but just the compression and everything of the sound. And one was James King and the other one was John Vickers. And I was very lucky to be able to hear both of them as a young tenor. And that's about as far back as I went. I was not old enough to have heard Corelli, which was another tenor that I greatly admired. But I did hear King and Vickers a lot. And it was mainly just the voice. I mean, I thought, wow, what a sound. And of course, he didn't have quite the career in the United States that Vickers did, but in Europe, he was known as the King. And I remember reading a review one time in Zurich, it said, King ist König. For a Meistersinger, he did at 65 years old, I think. So I just found it to be a remarkable voice. He was very open to young singers. If you wanted to go to Germany to audition, he'd say, I have a home in Bad Tölz, which is outside of Munich. He'd give you the key. People would stay there and do auditions. In an age today of social media and everybody so worried about their image and their presence, it was refreshing to see someone as famous and as respected as him that was just open and willing to lend a hand.
Well, your comments elicit at least 10 questions for me, but I'm going to start with one that you might not expect. In America, we have a television program that's very popular called Jeopardy! People elsewhere in the world may not know it, but basically it's a big wall with questions or answers. You have to give the question, and there are categories. And so now I'm going to do opera singers from Kansas, because Kansas is not, in terms of population, a big state. It's a large state. It's where most of our wheat comes from, and a lot of our beef is butchered there. But Joyce DiDonato, Alan Held, Joyce Castle, Samuel Ramey. I didn't even know about James King. You, how is it that a state that I believe it's Wichita State University has a very good school of opera, but what is it about Kansas that can produce these really remarkable singers?
Oh gosh. I'm not sure about this, but I think George Gray could be added to that list.
Okay.
I heard someone say once that, and it might have been James King, I'm not sure, that it's where the voice lies. And we don't get all back in our throats, sort of like you hear with some of the Southern dialects. Kansas is sort of this mix of a bit of Southern, but also a very forward, bright, resonant sound. And I think it lends itself to the mask and the ping and the ring that singers are after. Alan Held actually was not from Kansas, but he lives there now. He teaches at Wichita State. And interesting fact, he was the best man in my wedding. So we went to graduate school together in Wichita. And Joyce, but then of course Sam Ramey is legendary.
Colby, Kansas, in the western part of the state. Yeah. So, since you're mentioning the pattern of speech there and the way the mouth is positioned, it links to the next question I had for you, which was, many American Helden tenors, heroic tenors, go to Europe and have careers in Europe and are largely unknown in the States or appear
Right.
here a bit. And many of them are from Oklahoma, which is the state south of Kansas. And I wonder whether the positioning Oklahoma is more south of the mouth and the way of speech has led to that development of many Helden tenors in the state of Oklahoma. Not
Mhm.
all. Clay Hilly, who's the current big star, is from Georgia. He was on the show recently. And they do come from other parts of the United States. Brandon Jovanovich is from Illinois. But my question really is, America seems to lose its Helden tenors to Europe,
Right.
whereas some of the dramatic heroic sopranos, Lisa Lindstrom, Christine Goerke, others, do have careers in the States. Why is that?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is just the repertoire. Um, Even smaller B and even some C-sized houses in Germany are all doing Wagner. They're doing Der Freischütz. They're doing, the Strauss operas, especially. I mean, for a young Helden tenor, the Strauss roles fit quite well because they're generally a higher tessitura than a Siegmund is, and they're a little bit more lyric, a little more lyricism in the legato lines and things than the Wagner tends to be, and they're performed over there. I don't remember, other than the Met, the last, or the Chicago, the last time I saw a Frau und Schatten in the United States. Um,
San
or
Francisco, I think, but not all that recently.
or a Totestadt.
Yeah.
Some of these operas just are very rarely done here, but they're commonly performed in Europe, and so and then other thing is just the sheer amount of opera houses. I mean, what do we have? Roughly 75 opera houses in all of North America, and there's more opera houses than that in Germany alone.
German, yeah.
And so I think it's the opportunity. I think also the language. If you do speak a second language or even study a second language in the United States, German doesn't generally tend to be that language.
Mm-hmm.
Spanish, maybe French. So I think the language also has a lot to do with it. I think but I think mainly it's just the sheer volume of repertoire that they do over there.
But I wonder whether in the US, and I can't really speak for Canada too much, but a little, has veered away from that repertory. Because when I was younger, when you were younger, um, we did have a healthy mix of Wagner and Richard Strauss and a couple of other composers of that type, Weber, things like that, where they would require a more heroic male tenor voice.
Mhm.
Vickers sang, and Fidelio is another one. The Met does Fidelio,
Right.
and periodically we see that. But John Vickers was here all the time
Right.
in New York, where I live. And when I worked at the Met, I interacted with him quite a bit. And he was very present, but he sang things like Canio in Pagliacci, in Otello. And I wonder whether the Americans who go to Europe to sing the heroic German roles, they probably are singing Canio and Otello and maybe Andrea Chenier and certain roles like that that can verge into the dramatic but are in another language, Italian or French. Um, Aeneas and Les Troyens. Um, it's I think I feel as an American opera lover and opera worker that we're missing out here because we're losing those men who are wonderful singers to European houses. Your explanation of why makes perfect sense.
Well, I think also in Europe there tends to be more flexibility. One of the biggest misnomers was when people said they're so strict about the fest system, and
Explain what that
and
is. Not
about
everybody knows what fest is.
Well, it's a fest contract where it means you're going to work for that opera house for an entire year. You'll sing 25 to 35 performances. You'll work middle of August, end of August through the 1st to the middle of June. They pay you a monthly salary. They pay your health insurance. You get vacation pay. You get what they call Weihnachtsgeld, which they give you at the holidays. Um,
Christmas money.
you can have a life, as we
Yeah.
say, it's I always suggest it for young singers because if you're lucky in the United States in the regional circuit, maybe you get 5, 6 jobs a year, maybe 7, and that's if you're going from job to job. And with all the cutbacks we've had, a company that used to do 6 performances maybe now is doing 4, maybe they're only doing 3. And so in that entire year, you might sing a third of the number of performances you would in Germany on a fest contract.
Mm-hmm.
And so to really learn your craft, to learn your repertoire, I feel it's vitally important for young singers. I do a lot of master classes, as you can imagine, with the young artist stuff that I do. And I always tell people, get to Europe, learn the language, learn to speak German. It's very important that you have some facility in the language. And I just think that the opportunity is so much greater. And then what I started to say also was about the Fox system, where they are very particular about what category your voice is. And for tenors, the same tenor that would be seen as like what they call a jugendlicher Heldentenor, which would sing, Bacchus, that would sing Max in Der Freischütz. That same person is also singing Cavaradossi, is singing Radames, is singing Canio. And so they don't separate so much the German from the Italian, from the Don Jose's, the Samsons, that kind of repertoire. So I think you also get a wider variety of repertoire that you can add to your sort of bag of roles that you do.
A singer who is a close friend of mine, I should say this in full disclosure, is Gregory Kundi.
Oh yeah,
And Greg is from Illinois
fabulous.
originally. And the arc of his career has been remarkable, almost singular in our time. He's a tenor. He is, I believe, 70, and forgive me, Greg, if I'm misquoting, but he is singing splendidly now. He began as what we might call a bel canto tenor, and he sang Bellini, Rossini, Donizetti, and so on. But then his voice grew and changed, and he began to do more of the dramatic roles, but mostly in the Italian language, although
Right.
he's a wonderful Aeneas and L'Etoile. He's tackling a bit of German roles here and there. He currently is doing Captain Vere in Britain's Billy Budd. And the degree to which his artistry evolves, Andrea Chenier, Calaf and Turandot. I've heard him in Aida in Vienna. I've heard him in Il Trovatore in London. And there is no tenor in the world who, at that age, or frankly, even significantly younger, who sings such a wide range of roles so incredibly well. And he basically is not cast much in the United States. And I think it's a terrible loss. And he does not want for work. He's very much in demand in Europe. He was honored by the Club of the 27, the Great Verdi Society, as a Verdi singer. He sings, he's really the only one to sing both Rossini's Otello and Verdi's Otello, which are very different kinds of roles. It's a remarkable career. And I'm not asking you to speculate, but you may have some thoughts on this. I'm baffled as to why we don't see him in America when he's having still such a thriving, remarkable career in Europe, being greatly acclaimed in the major opera houses of Europe.
And I could be wrong, but I think the Veer is being, I think he's singing Veer right. He was doing that in Vienna, and
Yes.
I'm pretty sure at 70 years old, that was a debut role for him.
Yes. With a
Yeah,
wonderful cast, including Brindley Sherritt and Hugh Hugh. Forgive me, I'm not remembering his wonderful singer's parents' name, both of them. And he's a baritone having a wonderful career. David Rendall is his father.
yeah.
And forgive me, Mom, I'm forgetting your name, but he comes from royal operatic blood in the United Kingdom. And so that was a superb cast that they had in Vienna, with, yes, Gregory Kundi making his debut in that role at the age of
Yeah.
7.
And the last, I heard another tenor, James King, debut the role at the Metropolitan Opera at a very late age as well.
Captain Beer.
The role fits itself extremely well to a tenor of that stature. I don't really know the answer to your question. I can speculate. I mean, I've heard Gregory many times. I mean, he's a fabulous singer. I mean, I heard his
Yeah.
Samson, at the Met. I mean, just an absolutely wonderful singer. And we've had a few exchanges on social media, as you do, and seems to be a very nice gentleman. Great. I'm sure he's a great colleague as well. In the United States, I think there's this feeling that we have to worry about selling tickets, which is that's starting to change in Europe with the financial cutbacks that even houses we're talking about financial cutbacks in Berlin right now, and whether the Komische Oper is going to survive, whether a town the size of Berlin needs 3 opera companies. And so this may change in Europe as well, but there's always been, whether it's the Met or whether it was Bill Mason when he was doing casting at Chicago of the Italian roles, this feeling that the names were selling the tickets. And I'm not sure that I've ever agreed with that outside of a Domingo or a Pavarotti or a Scotto or a Caballé or any of those people. I'm not, I see the names that are brought in sometimes. They're only names that are known in the opera world. Someone said one time, when we started getting cable television, we started to see the demise of the opera star.
Mm.
Because there used to be a time when there were only 3 channels. And my first exposure as a child growing up in Kansas to opera was seeing Pavarotti and Beverly Sills on the Johnny Carson show.
Yeah.
And it was a real outlet. I mean, those stations could make stars of people, or Ed Sullivan, they could literally make a star of a singer. And so.
More recently, I watched a rerun of the Carol Burnett show, and her
Right.
guests were Marilyn Horne and Eileen Farrell,
Yeah.
who are funny in addition to being great singers. So they
Yeah.
play comedy with Carol Burnett, but also really, really sing.
Right. And I remember when I was much younger, seeing Placido on the Carol Burnett show, and she did this whole skit about how she saw this person on the street in New York City, and she invited him to be on a show, and he walked in and he started singing, and she went, "Oh, that Domingo," and everybody laughed. But yeah, I mean, um, it was a different world then, and so today the idea of opera star takes a totally different connotation than it did back then. Then it was really about the singing. If you were going to be an opera star, it was really about the voice. I don't find that as much today. Today, I've actually had someone that runs a major company in the United States say to me that they check a singer's social media before they hire them.
Huh.
And I went, wow.
Well,
That's
because I mean,
very
I can think
valuable.
she's a friend of mine, a colleague. I've worked with her, a beautiful young soprano of great talent who is active on social media
Hmm.
and um, is has a following there. Now, we should say about social media that there are at least two types, even if we're in the Facebook category. Namely, there are people, opera people, who speak to other opera people on Facebook, and they're sort of closed groups, and they are about sharing advice and encouragement and throat doctors and things like that. But then there are those who create a fan base with their social media. I can remember, for example, at the beginning of Facebook, the wonderful soprano from Missouri, Illinois, Missouri, Christine Brewer, was
Sure.
sort of like, and I mean this is the best way, the den mother of opera singers, that she dispensed advice and encouragement in a social media context, but it was not really for the public. It was really meant for other younger singers who needed a shoulder or some sage advice. And Christine Brewer was the person to dole that out. She eventually sort of walked away from that. But I could remember early on that I would use Facebook as an opera educator
Right.
and try to guide people toward what to think about. And, you know, it's no secret that I have my friends, my preferences, but if there's a singer I don't care for, I will not knock that person. I'll just simply probably not include that person as an example of what I think of as
Right.
good singing. Although that even that's not fully true because there are singers whose work I don't necessarily care for, but they're very valid singers, and I will often present them in a social media context specifically so that that can start discussion. But I
Right.
know that in my role in opera that I can be seen as an advocate or an arbitrator, and I don't want to do that at all. I mean, advocate for the art form, absolutely.
Right.
Advocate for individuals, probably not. Um, but
And I think that's vitally important. I when I do master classes, I often say to young singers, and I don't say it in a negative way. I actually think of it as a positive statement where I say the majority of you are never going to sing on the stages of La Scala and the Royal Opera and the Met, but hopefully you will all become great ambassadors of the art form. And
mhm.
I think with arts education today that's really important that that message be brought across.
I also think, I mean, not I think, I know from my own experience that when I teach at universities, I try not to only teach opera to potential opera singers, but I
Right.
try to teach opera to medical students and law students and history students, especially history students, and engage them in discussions about the politics that Verdi lived in when he wrote, or Mozart when they wrote Le Notte di Figaro, when they wrote uh, Rigoletto, whatever opera was written that has a political underpinning. I
Right.
would go to the history majors, the poli sci majors. I would go to the language majors to talk about how the Italian in the libretto of Le Notte di Figaro is completely different from the Italian in Lucia di Lammermoor, which are more or less the same era. They're about 50 years apart. But somehow the Italian in Lucia, which came later, sounds older than the Italian in Le Notte di Figaro, which has a very contemporary parlato feeling about it.
Right.
But I believe that opera canon should be used to explore all aspects of ideas in education and not make it something fetishistic just for the people who are cultists of the voice, although that's important too. I'm going to push back a little on the subject of the Lyric Opera Chicago, which is a company that I worked at a lot at the beginning of my career and had a long relationship with. But it was my first company to work at. And they, under artist Kranick and then later Bill Mason, but especially artist Kranick, understood that opera singers could have followings, and that even a name like Anna Tomova Sintov, who was a great singer, but her name did not roll off the tongue in Chicago. or New York, although she sang in both places a lot, especially Chicago. But they understood how to build her career and build an audience. So that you would buy a ticket to anything Anna Tomova Sintov was in. Later, the wonderful Catherine Malfitano. The same thinking that you you build a reputation for an artist in Chicago, and she or he will have an audience, and people go only because they're singing. Um, I think the Met style in San Francisco was a little more about we put on great operas with great singers, and if you buy a ticket, you're guaranteed of getting a great performance. Chicago always made a point of putting the stars forward. Of even in their publicity, you'd walk outside the theater on Wacker Boulevard Avenue, Street, Road on Wacker, as they said in Chicago. Um, and you'd see all the faces of every star in the season outside for the entire season. In alphabetical order, by the way, not that Domingo would be on top. But if Domingo was D and Anna Tomova Sintov was T, there was always in alphabetical. And for the entire season, and that was sort of a point of pride in Chicago, that we in Chicago attract the greatest stars in opera.
And I think traditionally they did. I mean,
Yeah.
all of the great singers sang in Chicago. And that was, and I think when we started that part about the conversation, we were talking about Greg, and perhaps, I don't know this, but perhaps he would have sung more in the United States if a Bill Mason had taken him as one of those singers and built that reputation around him.
And he's from Illinois.
Yeah.
He's a hometown boy there.
Yeah. But no, I didn't. Bill Mason was running the company when I started working there with them with singers. And I have to say he was a joy to work with.
Yes.
He understood singing. And I think this is something that's sorely missing in the profession today. Whether it was a Bill Mason, whether it was a Mortier in Madrid, or whether it was a Robert Lyle, down in New Orleans. These were people that you could sit for an hour and a half in their office, go through a roster and have conversations about singers, have conversations about what they're going to be doing in 5 years, how you see the direction of their career going, and they would engage in those conversations. That rarely happens. I'm the president of the Opera Managers Association in Europe, and I have been for the last 5 years. And one of the biggest frustrations among opera managers is that casting directors today don't take the time to have the conversations about the singers, to where sometimes it leaves us wondering, what are they looking for in the casting? Because if they don't want to sit and talk about a singer, and talk about the flight of that singer, the direction that you see that singer going, and I think the difference with the Bill Mason at Chicago is that he would engage in that conversation, and then he would actually help to try to make that happen. And that rarely happens today. Whether it's Chicago, the Met, or Liebig or Wiesbaden, I mean, it rarely happens today that you're able to have those conversations about young singers. And in some ways, I was talking to someone that Ken Benson, who I have great respect for as a manager, and I've known him for a long time. And we're almost losing generations of singers today because we're not investing that kind of time and effort, in those careers and in the development of those careers. And that's something I would like to see change in the profession. It's something through the Managers Association, through Trentino with the Young Artist Program, that we're trying to instill in casting directors. We invite them to come and hear the singers because we want them to spend time doing that.
For people who don't know, the Lyric Opera of Chicago was founded or opened on November 1st of 1954 with Maria Callas as Norma. And they then did Tosca. And by the way, it was a great coup that Callas, who was a New Yorker, sang her American debut not in New York but Chicago, and later went to Dallas and then the Met, or the Met and then Dallas, sorry. Um, and she, when she was in Tosca, the shepherd boy in the third act was sung by a little boy named Billy Mason. And
Oh,
Billy Mason grew up in that company and became Bill or William Mason.
oh,
The Lyric was founded by a triumvirate that included primarily Carol Fox and two gentlemen who then went and founded the opera in Dallas. And then she was succeeded by Artis Kranick, who had a glorious reign.
right.
And when she became ill, eventually it went to Bill Mason and then Anthony Freud. And it's a company that until Anthony Freud hired from within. And they were part of the culture of the Lyric Opera of Chicago. They had a fellow named Danny Newman, who was a genius at marketing and developing subscriptions. And they developed great pride in the company. And the city saw it as an asset, just like the Chicago Bulls and the Chicago Bears and the Blues and every other thing that Chicago is wonderful for. The symphony, of course. The Lyric Opera became part of that firmament of things that Chicagoans could be proud of. And that was primarily Artis Kranick who did that.
Right.
And also the fact that they liked, and I don't blame them, to point at us New Yorkers and say, see, we did this first, or we got it better, or we've had more Tito Gobi and Alfredo Kraus and Morella Freni and the people they had. And they had Bruno Bartoletti, the conductor, who helped for many years, and he helped form a relationship with La Scala so that singers and musicians came from Milan to Chicago rather than New York. They would later get to New York, the exception being Renata Tebaldi, but almost
And
all the others, and Franco Corelli, but all the others, the great ones, went to Chicago first.
and later, when Bill was running the company, he always had Italians in the Italian operas. I mean, he kept that tradition of bringing Europeans to the house, which I think was important with what
And
he.
therefore spoke of a star system, but frankly, given what you and I were just talking about, maybe marginalized some Americans.
I'm sure it did, but on the other side of the coin, I think it's important to have that mix. And I never found, if we had a singer that was worthy of singing in Chicago, they always sang in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And that was thanks to him
Yeah.
and conversations that you could have. And so no, I miss having that. I miss Gerard Mortier, where you could walk into his office and um, he'd pull out the big ledgers and he'd talk about the operas he had planned for the next 5 years,
Mm-hmm.
and he'd be very genuinely interested in your singers. And if you could convince him that that was a good fit, he would hire them, and then he wouldn't just hire them once; he'd hire them again and again. So there was that sense of building careers, and I don't even call it building careers. I call it investing in the future of our art form.
So this brings us back in a way to the role that you have of the artist manager. And I should distinguish for listeners that there are at least two types of managers: the ones who have a roster of singers whom they represent as their advocate and agent, and then the managers who run arts organizations.
Right.
And, so a general manager, a artistic director, those kind of people. Sometimes they come and go between the two. For example, Matthew Epstein was both a manager for artists, but also worked for the Lyric Opera of Chicago, for Welsh National Opera, for
Right.
companies within the walls of the opera house themselves. So, but you as the manager of artists, what is speak for yourself, but also all of your colleagues whom you respect. What is their role in shaping the taste of people in theaters? And I don't mean the audiences, but I mean the people who would give the jobs to the singers and conductors.
I think it's changed over the years, possibly changed drastically. I mean, Matthew Epstein, who you just mentioned, was a real career builder. When I was first starting out, if you could get managed by Matthew Epstein, you had arrived at a certain level, and you knew you were in good hands moving that career forward. Probably one of the greatest that we've ever had at really building careers because Matthew was invested in the repertoire. He instinctually, well, not instinctually, he actually educated himself in the repertoire. That doesn't happen as much today. I think people go into management for different reasons. I always say, if your singing career didn't work, you shouldn't assume that you can manage, because it's a brutal profession in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And in many ways a thankless profession. We kid about how artists will get on social media and thank everyone, from the person that cleaned their apartment that morning to their parents to the people that run the houses. And it's like, oh yeah, but don't you have managers behind you that are pushing this as well? And so managers are often sort of left in the dark. And so one of the things that happened during COVID that I think was very positive is that we were all sitting around with nothing to do. My lawyer said to me one day, we had him over for a barbecue we were having in August of the first year of the pandemic. And he said, so what have you been, what's going on? And I said, I said, well, we're in the middle of a pandemic. This is what's going on. And he said, no, what's going on in the opera world? And I said, well, Jeff, I said, it was Saturday night. I said, there's not a live opera, Broadway, theater, pop concert, hip hop concert, rock concert happening anywhere in the world tonight.
Mm-hmm.
And he stopped for a second. He went, oh my God, when you put it that way, that's what our profession got hit with.
Yeah.
Very, very few professions, saw, just the total stoppage in every genre of what we do that the arts saw. And museums being closed. I mean, everything. And so out of that, a group of us managers got together. Myself, a manager from Spain, one from Italy, two from Italy, one from Germany, about a dozen of us. And we just started talking. We started Zooming. And what we drew from those Zoom calls was the fact that we have decades and decades of experience between us. We could cast any opera in the world, among our knowledge of the repertoire, our knowledge of historical knowledge of what singers, would fit into that. And yet we also acknowledged the fact that we had very little influence in those casting decisions. And so one of the things that we did is we formed this group called Opera Managers Association International, called OMAI. And we're up to over 100 members now. We have national, international conferences. We had one in Madrid, Stockholm last year. This year is in Paris. And we have really started lobbying with the Opera Americas of the world, the Opera Europas, to really
explain briefly, what is Opera America and Opera Europa?
Well, Opera America is I guess you would call it the parent organization of all the North American opera houses.
Often called a service organization as well.
Service organization,
Yeah.
correct. And Opera Europa is the sister group in Europe except it's much larger in scope in that there's 250 opera houses that are members of Opera Europa. And so in March, I will be, sorry, I broke your rule. I mentioned
March of 2025.
March of 2025, I will be on a panel in Barcelona dealing with emerging singers and how we help those singers get those careers started. We also just received, through Opera Europa, they just received a $3 million grant from the European Union. One of the things that it will allow us to do is to go into all the opera studios in Europe and for managers to sit down with casting directors and mentor these young singers as they go through that process. So we've really made a lot of positive progress in including managers in the decision making of getting those young careers started. And there's a lot more work to do. We advocate for singers for something as silly as rehearsal pay. Should a singer be paid to rehearse? A lot of companies don't think they should.
Yeah.
So, we advocate for that. We advocate for even little things like, my singer shouldn't have to pay for their flight and their housing. You should be paying for that for them. So, we advocate for singers almost like a union for them. And we also then have a mission to try to bring new managers into the profession. We have very little diversity, almost no diversity in our profession as managers. So that's something we try to help with. Trying to have mentorships where we can take interns and bring them into our offices and train them in the management profession. And so it's been a very successful organization and one that I'm very proud of that we've, and I think we are bringing positive change to the profession through the work that we're doing with that.
By the way, when the pandemic came, I was working in London on a great production of Fidelio and had to drop everything, come back home to New York. And because of the particular circumstances in my personal life, I'd not left New York in those years. And I knew that I had to reshape my opera life and my other life to stay here. And so that's how this program was born on a dud. I was on a program, Thomas Hampson hosted a program, and he called me up one morning from Zurich and he said, Fred, do you know what adagio is? Yes, I do. Well, today is Tuesday, and I would like you to join Tom on Tuesday.
I remember those.
I said, when? He said, today. It was about 7 in New York, so 1 PM in Zurich. He said 3 hours. He said, you have Zoom? I do. And I sort of splashed water on my face and woke up. And I said, Tom on Tuesday, Fred on Friday. And that's
great.
Born. The week later, I began Fred Plotkin on Fridays. And as of January of 2025, I'll have done 250 shows.
And congratulations.
Thank you. And it became initially not to console singers and conductors and managers about not working, but to document who they are and what they think about. Because among my first guests were Thomas Hampson, Christine Goerke, Ben Heppner, Julia Bullock, and Ferruccio Furlanetto. Those are my first 5. Yeah. And I decided, okay. And then I had Manfred Honig and Rosalind Plowright. With Zoom, I can travel the world.
Right.
Number 1. Number 2, if these people who normally are on vocal rest can speak to me for an hour about things that they care about and know about, it's important to take this pandemic and document for history, not just what the pandemic was about, but what Thomas Hampson, Christine Gerke, Ben Hepner, Julia Bullock, and Ferruccio Furlanetto think. Imagine getting Ferruccio Furlanetto to talk about the bass roles without being on vocal rest. It was
Right.
remarkable. And so I've made it my mission ever since to include primarily people from our business, but also authors and journalists and chefs and conservationists and things that I care about. I've been able to include them, and it's become about the documentation of ideas in the past 5 years and almost 5 years. And I'm very pleased with that. And for as long as I do this, I'm very happy that someone in the future will be able to look at Mitchell Piper's conversation with me and learn from what you know, what I know, and so forth. Even talk about James King and talk about
Right.
Bill Mason. This is knowledge that you and I and people in the business share that should be out there, and it's not necessarily out there. So, having said that, I don't believe we're out of the pandemic, but I believe we're in a later phase of the pandemic. How has that affected the opera business?
Well, oh gosh, it's affected it in so many ways, Fred. I could probably start a series called Mitch on Monday that we could just go over how the pandemic is affecting.
George.
Um, from the initial phases, it was dealing with the cancellations. And we had some companies that were absolutely wonderful. They paid the contracts out. The singers didn't have to go on welfare. They were able to pay their bills. We had other companies, one in New York that we all know of, that decided that the scope of what that would do to them was not something they could take on, which I understand. And so they were not able to pay those fees out. And then for the next year, really the major scope of OMAI's work with the managers was dealing with the companies. I read more force majeure clauses than you can imagine. And we worked.
Define that. I know what that is, but define force majeure.
Well, the idea that if something cancels the performances and it's considered an act of God, war, labor disputes, these types of things, then the company is not liable to pay anything. And so all contracts have always had that in there, but we never read them, because it really wasn't anything we had to deal with. And all of a sudden, every company was claiming force majeure. But we found as we started working with people that one thing that the pandemic did is it brought out the best in human nature in a lot of people. And we started working together. We started having conversations. Houses were saying, yeah, you're right. It's really not right that these singers go with nothing. Some of them paid a third. We got the Paris Opera to go up to 50%, which was the second largest budget in the world for opera house. It was amazing that we were able to do that. And so that sort of grew, then, and morphed into, now let's start reviewing these contracts as we go forward and make sure that if this ever happens again, singers will be protected. And so the pandemic caused a lot of turmoil just in the number of cancellations. The next few years then, and I'd say we're just now coming out of that with the 24-25 season, where we're no longer looking at canceled productions. We're now starting to cast into the future. But for those first couple of years after that, it was a lot of just cancellations that they were trying to reschedule.
Yeah.
And as you can imagine with singers' schedules, sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't. The other thing, and this is something I'm not quite sure why it changed, but I was laughing with one of my singers who's making her debut at the Royal Opera House this season. And I sent her a contract and she said, wow, this contract's really long. And I said, yeah, I said, before the pandemic, contracts were 2, maybe 3 pages long. Now they're 6, 7 pages long with 2-page addendums. And yeah, so the manager's work is sort of doubled just reading the contracts these days. Houses are also struggling. It's a different struggle in Europe than it is in the United States, because the United States has never enjoyed much government subsidy. So in the United States, it's are we going to maintain our donor base? Our corporations, immediately after COVID, a lot of corporations pulled out of doning because they said we need to deal with human issues of healthcare and things like this that need our attention. In Europe, they always had that kind of thing taken care of with their taxes, but it was so large that after that, I think Frankfurt was really well publicized of being one of the first companies of saying we're getting hit with a 20% cut in our subsidies.
Yeah.
And when a house depends on 80% of their budget through subsidies, a 20% cut is huge. And so now that's what we're dealing with in Europe. So I think Peter Gelb said it quite well in the UK for a conference that they had here that took place in November of 24, where he said houses are doing fewer productions and fewer performances of those productions, and fees have also come down for the singer.
Yeah.
So when you couple all 3 of those together, you might have singers making 30, 40, 50% less than they were making in 2019.
So I think I know the answer, but I would like you to define it for our listener. When a manager will now ask not only for the fee for the artist, but that she get paid for rehearsal, that she get a flight, that she get housing, that she may get a per diem budget for food, right. The things that are necessary, perhaps tax abatements, because if she's singing, say, in Switzerland, but she's an American, how do you sort of, I know that from my own work, that Switzerland is a special thing in terms of the tax consequences for the U.S. and Switzerland, but I'm sure it applies to many countries. The manager gets a percentage of what?
Most managers take anywhere from 10 to 20% of what they negotiate. And
so the singer's fee or the entire package that might include the airline and the housing?
No. I mean, I suppose each manager company is different. In our management company, we don't take commission on per diems. That money's for you to eat. We don't take commission on any housing money or flight money, even if we negotiate a higher fee for you. I have a singer in Dresden that's singing Paglione. I was able to negotiate 2 flights from the house instead of 1 because there's a break in between. But we don't commission any of that. We commission the fee, and then if we negotiate rehearsal fees, we commission those as well. And that's pretty standard. And the standard commissions are 10% for staged opera in the United States. But most of us that have European artists as well, many of us are charging 12.5% because that's sort of the standard in Europe. And then some managers charge a little bit more for concert work. And so that's sometimes you'll get up to 20 with that. So that's very standard in the profession. And then out of that, we pay for our own travel to go see an artist.
Yes, I know.
Like I said, I have several artists making debuts at the Royal Opera House this season. We will go to those debuts, but we'll pay for our flights, our housing, our own per diems. So all of that comes out of the commission that you get from the artists.
There are numerous artists I know who, when you go to their website or speak to them personally, if you're friends or working with them, and they will say, I'm represented in North America by, I'm
Right.
represented for concerts in Spain by someone else. I'm represented for um, other things in Austria. Some people have worldwide representation, others have broken up representation. How does that happen and why does it exist?
Um, I think it happens for two reasons. One is opportunity and one is necessity. Um, I will be in December of 2024. I speak at a conference in London, and they asked me to specifically talk about the future of opera. And one of the things that we've seen during the past, in the 20, really from about 21 or 22 forward, we've seen a lot of mergers. We've seen a lot of acquisitions, a lot of alliances that are being formed. And whenever you have a business merger, you tend to have one side that does it because it's an opportunity. The other side often does it because it's a necessity.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the health of the profession is something that we really have to keep an eye on in the next few years. We've had some very big mergers. And if I was running those companies, I would not be patting myself on the back for those mergers. I would be saying, why were the coffers so depleted that those mergers were needed in the first place?
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that we're going to have to keep an eye on. And and I think a lot of this is going to be driven by politics. Um,
You
if
say politics, you mean politics within the opera business or the
Well,
government
I mean world politics.
or politics?
I think far too often in the arts, I think we try to create this insular feeling around our art form, and we need to break through that and understand that what happens outside is really what's dictating, what we're capable of doing, what not capable, what we're able to accomplish. And when countries are paying for wars, when right-wing governments are going in that are really, and I know you're not a political show, but I mean, when right-wing governments are going in and the main focus is to serve the top 5% of a population, something has to give. And it creates an uneasiness, whether it's Italy or whether it's the United States with our elections. It creates the sense of uncertainty with what's going to happen. And one of the first things that gets cut are budgets to what they see as things that are not really necessary. And unfortunately, culture and art fall under that category. So I think as we look into 2025, 2026 and beyond, we need to keep an eye on world politics because I think it will be the driving force of whether we succeed or whether we don't succeed. And I think there's a danger to say, well, the arts have never been funded very well in the United States, or, well, these operas are hundreds of years old and they're still being performed. I think that's a naive way of looking at it and a very sort of simple way of looking at it that we have to be careful of.
The question I'm about to ask you, I'm going to ask you to not name names, not that you would have, but you and I certainly could be very inclined to name names, but we're not going to because it's really about the philosophy of the question rather than naming individuals. You mentioned very correctly before that social media mean that people engage in discussions in different ways than if we're sitting facing one another.
Right.
I have my own very distinct political views. There are many people in our profession who don't share my views. And
Mine
yet
as well.
I know that. And I work with those people, and I often have to, if it's a manager in a theater or in an agency, have to call those people and collaborate with those people. if it's an artist whom I'm going to direct or coach, or if it's an artist who I may invite to be on this program or my classes at New York University, or just someone that I care about and want to engage with artistically,
Right.
I know that their politics may not be mine. And I try to make a point of, number one, not discriminating against those artists, even if their political views to me are repugnant, but also, frankly, not favoring the people whose political views align with mine. Because if tenor A is my opposite view and tenor B is my view, but he's tenor B,
Yeah.
we want tenor A. And therefore, I believe we need to work with all of these people. However, it is a bit of a minefield out there in terms of our profession, in terms of social media, that memories build up, so that there are people in our profession who don't agree with you or they don't agree with me. And I think underneath it could create antipathy and make it harder to work with them, even if they're very professional and approach their field professionally. And when it comes to music, they put the music first. The question, I suppose, is how do you navigate that issue?
I think the first way you navigate it is just with pure honesty. You say we disagree. You try to be respectful. Sometimes I delete comments of mine because I find I wasn't as respectful as I wanted to be. Because we all get tied up in this. We have families, we have colleagues, we have friends, and these decisions affect everything. The 3 or 4 people that I tend to go round and round with on Facebook with politics, they're also 3 or 4 people that I have great respect for. And the other day, one of them, who you know, actually wrote me a private message. And he said, I noticed you put something, about your daughter and the LGBTQ community, and I just want to make sure that you're okay, and that, I know we support different people, but please know I wish you the best with, and so I think there is that happens in our profession. As you say, we probably would say things a little differently if we were sitting having a drink in a living room, as opposed to where you can just easily type it and be done. But I think also, I grew up in a household where our best friends were of a different political party than what we were, but yet the 2 political parties were maybe this far apart. And I realize you're not on Zoom, so I'm putting my hands pretty close together. Today, it is this chasm between the parties and between the views. And I
We're all on Zoom. Everybody's watching you.
Yes. But it's made it more difficult,
Yeah.
for sure. And I have artists that are like this too. I have a couple of artists that I'm like, guys, you can't really say that on social media. You got to delete that, because as managers, we're also monitoring, what's going on that could possibly affect someone's careers.
Yeah.
So it's a delicate situation, I think, especially today. I think it's fair to say in my lifetime since 2016, it's the most divisive that I've ever seen the political parties be with each other. And I hope Justice Ginsburg is right. She said, I never worry about the pendulum swinging too far in one direction, because it always eventually comes back. And I hope she's correct for the sake of, I have 3 children under 30, and I hope for their sake that the late justice is correct.
By the way, that you're referring to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Her son James was my guest on this program a few months ago, and he is the family renegade in that he did not go into the legal profession like his parents and sister, but he went into the opera business because
That's right.
his parents loved opera, and he was raised right, and therefore he founded a recording label in Chicago um, that promotes music and musicians from Chicago, and not only. And he's doing noble work. The
Well,
thing,
and I think she's a perfect example. Excuse me. I
yeah,
think she's a perfect example. Her best friend was Justice Scalia, and they could not have been on more opposite sides of politics and policy,
hmm
but yet opera brought them together.
yeah.
And I remember during the pandemic giving a speech at a conference in Berlin. And I said through all the troubles that we're having, we have to look to art. We have to look to music and culture to heal the wounds, to bring people together. I mean, that's the one great thing that I think our profession can still do.
There's another component to my question, namely, even if you and another person don't agree on world politics as they stand today or the politics of any country, opera itself is the most political art form. At
Right.
least since Monteverdi's L'Incarnazione di Poppea, many of the greatest operas are profoundly political. And the way that they are received by audiences depends somewhat on who's performing them and staging them, but also how the audience receives them. And again, I'm not here to advocate the politics of one composer or another or what their operas say, because just to take the famous example, Wagner, um, his operas can be performed in so many different ways
Right.
that whatever your political outlook, you could almost find your view in it. Just take the Ring, and sometimes people say it's not cognizant of religion or that the gods represent people, that it's environmental destruction. Whatever view you take of the Ring cycle, um, Siegmund and Sieglinde, brother and sister, produce a child. Not too many people across the political spectrum are upset by that. And,
Sure.
he goes on and forms a relationship with his aunt Brunhilde, who's 18 years older. No one seems to get upset about that. But except John Vickers, actually, who would not sing certain Wagnerian roles, Tannhäuser primarily, claiming that they were repugnant politically and socially, although I think it was
Yeah.
also a question that he didn't feel he would be sound good as Tannhäuser because he was a great Tristan and Siegmund and so forth. But
Big.
and Parsifal.
Yeah.
But the fact that what we work on is political means that there's that too. So that I and singer tenor A may disagree profoundly on the politics of our world, but if I put him in Andrea Chenier, um, he's governed by the politics of that opera in that time
Right.
and the French Revolution, and perhaps as a poet, Andre Chenier was neither of this party or that party, but something else again. And in rehearsal rooms and in classes and so on, we explore these ideas, and we try without prejudice to understand what the creators, namely the composer and the librettist, intended. Um, have you run into problems in that regard, in that these works are so political and we have to put aside some of what we believe, which is very passionate, to go into the politics of the work? Or what's your response?
I haven't really had artists. I've had artists over the years that because I knew their religious background, I was worried about them singing particular roles. But the artists didn't look at it that way. The artists looked at it like I'm a character. I'm not. Um, what's that old saying? I don't identify my life as opera. I identify my life as my children, as my relationships, these types of things. And so I think it depends on the artist if they're able to put that aside, in order to deal with that. And then also, like if you're doing Nabucco, Va Pensiero is a beautiful chorus in New York City, But in Milan or Bologna, especially, it's seen as a national anthem
Yeah.
and gets repeated in
Yeah.
almost every performance.
Yeah.
And so it's a lot of it is how the and I think they do have more of a passion for that art form in Europe than we do in the United States.
Hmm.
We haven't really quite developed that type of following. I think the closest we could come are maybe some of the new operas that are being written, Champion and some of the things that have premiered at the Met recently. Probably in this country started with Porgy and Bess,
Yeah.
and I think you can find that real strong feeling of association with those operas for a certain segment of our population. But in Europe, it's almost like they're born with it.
Yeah.
It's a different
Part of
feeling.
the patrimony.
Right.
So as we wind up, I want to devote a good amount of time to talking about a place that I love deeply, um, namely the Trentino part of Italy. Italy, for people who don't know, has 20 regions, which are like American states or provinces. And a small one in the Northeast is called the Trentino Alto Adige. And Alto Adige is the upper part of the Adige River that runs from there down through the Trentino and down into Verona.
Right.
And so we're in the Northeast in the Tri Veneto. So we have the Veneto, Trentino Alto Adige, and Friuli Venezia Giulia. And the Dolomite Mountains are there. These are
Yeah.
technically part of the Alps, but not really because they look different from the Alps. The Alps tend to be more pyramid shaped, and the Dolomites are often sort of shards of beautiful, shiny stone that reflects and creates a different warmth. And there's skiing, there's beautiful agriculture. The great wine district is up there as well. The apples of Trentino, the baking of Trentino is pretty fabulous. The mushrooms of Trentino, I don't know if you know that in the region of Trentino or the province of Trentino, um, police officers have to be trained as mycologists. In other words, experts on mushrooms, because the mushroom gathering there is so great that if you have any question about is this poisonous or not, you go to the police station and they will tell you is this good or not good, which
Yeah.
can be very operatic. Imagine that. if you're sleeping with the police officer's spouse and you go in and
In Italy. Yeah.
poisonous, no, it's fine. And then così si muore. That's how you die from the mushrooms. The
Right.
cheeses, there's something called a malga, Malga, in the
Yeah, they're
Trentino, which
wonderful.
are these
Yeah.
sheds up in the mountains where the shepherds, not the shepherds, the cowherds go up with the cows in the warm weather in the Alps. They feed on the grasses in June and July. They produce these gorgeous milks that become cheeses that are made in the malga and then brought down in the autumn. It's beautiful lakes up there. Um, it's a wonderful little bit of paradise, and you create a festival there. How did
And
that?
that's exactly right. We feel like for 8 weeks every summer we are in paradise. It
Yeah.
is just um, stunning. Neil Gorin, who you know very well, is one of our conductors.
Yeah.
And last summer he posted a picture of the gorgeous stream, the crystal clear water with the mountains in the background, and he just wrote "On my way to the office." And it's an absolutely stunning area. And if I can tell you, we came about it very Italianate and very operatic. We had a festival in Bruges, Belgium. Wonderful festival. We did the European premiere of Mark Adamo's Little Women there. We're doing the Italian premiere of it this summer, directed by Robin Blowers and conducted by David Jackson from the Metropolitan Opera. And
In
so
English or Italian?
no, in English, in English.
So not piccole donne.
No, we're not translating it, but we will have super titles for them.
Yeah.
So I was saying, Belgium may not be the place for this opera festival. Maybe we should move it to Italy. So a friend of mine who was coaching, he was on our coaching staff, he said, "Oh, you have to go to Trento and talk to Simone." So we went to Trento. We saw Simone, who runs the conservatory there. And she said, "Oh, the conservatory is closing. We don't have time, but you should talk to Maurizio." So then we go to talk to Maurizio, who was her former boyfriend, who they broke up because the coach that sent me there started dating Simone. And so, but they all remained very good friends. And so Maurizio takes me and he introduces me to people at dinner that are in charge of a man named Paolo Manfredi, who was in charge of culture and tourism for all of Trentino Alto Adige. And he says, "Oh, you should go up to this little town in the Dolomites." So 2 days of running all over, sort of like an Italian movie. We end up in the Dolomites. I meet with the mayor, and he shows me spaces. They offer us a grant, and the next year we're in Trentino. And that's
What's the town?
it's we're in the same area with, it's called Primiero, and so it's a newly formed town where they took 6 or 7 smaller towns and put them under the name of Primiero. It's Mezzano. The most famous is San Martino di Castrozza.
Yes.
It's a famous ski town, and
there I know.
yeah. And so that's the most famous of the places, and we have wonderful audiences. Everything we do is standing room only. It's they really appreciate the culture coming in, and we bring about 200 artists in every summer for 8 weeks. It's a combination of young artists that we train and professional artists that come in. This summer we're doing 4 operas, 2 musicals, which are all fully staged with orchestra. There'll be half a dozen orchestra concerts, wow, chamber music concerts. So we have a dance studio. We have Martha Graham, wow, a person who actually danced and trained with Martha Graham. And so it's really a terrific place. And being able to train these young musicians and dancers and actors, and to see them, many of them, the first time on stage, and to do it in a place like that is just really stunning. And then we want them to experience Italy. So they have weekends. They go to Verona. I had for my roster 2 seasons in a row the Aida in Verona. And so we would take a bus of them to Verona and let them see Aida, and go backstage afterwards, and they'll go to Venice and walk the canals. All of this is, as you know, it's all very close together.
Yeah.
And it's our 10th anniversary in the Dolomites. So
even north of there in Bolzano, because again, to clarify, the region's called Trentino Alto Adige, but there are 2 provinces in the region: the province of Bolzano, or Bozen, and the province of Trentino, where the capital is Trento. Trento is famous for the Council of Trent, 1563, that led to the schism, to the reconstruction of the Catholic Church, to the reforms and the pushbacks and all of that, what that meant. But Bolzano is Südtirol. The first language is German, although in Bolzano more Italian. But if you go to towns like Bressanone, Brixen, it's Altdeutsch, and Meran, which is Merano. Meran is a wonderful city that Dr. Freud used to go to with his favorite patients and do what's called Frauenkur, which is a great cure. You go in September, and in the morning you walk on one bank of the river, in the afternoon you walk on the other bank of the river. And what I'm saying, I'm not making up. You drink fresh grape juice from the vineyards that has not yet become wine. It's very purgative. And therefore, when you're walking along the river, when you suddenly have a need, there are these clean installations that you go into and you clear out, so to speak. And you do that in the morning, and then you have a rest, and then you do it in the afternoon. And each year in the fall, it's sort of the spring cleaning is one thing, fall cleaning is another. And but Milan has great music festivals and all that area of Italy, which is basically if you take the train from Innsbruck to Verona, you go passing through that unless you get off. It's a fabulous part of the world.
Yeah,
Gustav
wonderful
Mahler,
wines, wonderful wines.
yeah, superb wine.
Ferrari sparkling wine is in Trento.
Yep,
And it's just really, and the food is just
superb.
amazing.
Yeah, it's superb.
Yeah.
And so therefore waiting to be discovered. Gustav Mahler, late in his life, in his last years, went to a town called Toblach, Toblach, or Dobbiaco in Italian. At that time, it would still belong to Austria, but is now part of Italy. And it's technically in the Veneto, but practically in Südtirol. And the contributions to opera and to music that this small place has made is phenomenal. And I'm very happy that you set up there. How can you find out about it? What's the website?
It's the Trentino Music Festival.org.
Okay. And yes.
Well, I was going to say also, I mean, Bolzano, and they still have the Mahler Festival there,
They do.
Summers. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful place. And it's 45 minutes from where we are. It's really
I wonder if you've come across a friend of mine whose name is Francesco Ciluffo. Francesco is a conductor, and he was born in Torino. He lives in Milan. One of his claims to fame, among many, is that he is the artistic or principal conductor of the Wexford Festival in Ireland.
Right.
And he speaks very British, Irish, English, but he also conducts all the time in Bolzano. And he conducts in what's called the Aslico, which is basically a confederation of theaters in Lombardy, Trentino, and Alto Adige that presents wonderful artists in smaller theaters. So not La Scala, but beautiful small theaters like Brescia, Como, Cremona, these classic theaters, but also in Bolzano. And he recently did La Voix Humaine, The Human Voice, with Anna Caterina Antonacci, one of the greatest singers of all, in my opinion, in that area in Bolzano and Trentino. So
I have a conductor on my roster that has conducted a lot in Bolzano, Arthur Fagan.
Sure.
And
also Atlanta, right?
Yeah, he's music director at Atlanta. And but it's the thing that I like about it is that when we're talking about festivals that train young singers and young orchestra and dancers, what I was looking for is a place that wasn't a major city, because I didn't want the distractions of a major city to interrupt the training process that we were trying to do. But yet I knew it needed to be something that was special. And the minute I drove into the valley, what we call the valley, the minute I drove into the valley in Primiero, I just, sighed and I just went, wow, this is it. And it just is, it's such a fabulous environment to train people. You're up in the mountains, the air is fresh, the weather is decent. There's hiking, if somebody's having a bad day, you just say, hey, basta, that's enough for today. Go take a hike. They go up the mountains, they take a hike, they think about their eval or their passaggio or whatever they're trying to work through at the moment. We had people there last year. We had people from 22 different countries. So we're able to bring a very international flair to it as well, and just really exceptional people for them to work with. And so it's really, it's really been a joy to be in that area and to train singers and just let them commune with nature. There's, as you probably know this, but there's one particular forest which is where Stradivarius used to cut the trees for his
Yes.
instruments, and it's
Yep.
called the Forest of the Violins.
Yeah.
And they do these walks at night that are candlelit, and it's just this magic. It's a magical place.
It is.
Very fortunate to have found it.
So, final question: do European casting directors and opera managers come and listen to performances and perhaps find some talent?
They do, and we have. It's very easy to get there because they can train or bus or fly to Venice. We pick them up, bring them up to the mountains. I try to use my connections to take advantage to have them do master classes while they're there as well, and just to put the knowledge that they have out there for the young singers. And then I took I had a young Mexican bass, and I think part of the success of what we do, young Mexican bass who was in the Mexican Opera Studio. He had no money to get there, so we found a donor. We got him there. He just gave amazing performances of Bartolo in Le Nozze and Zarastro. I did some phone calls. He ends up at AVA, and he just sang. I just saw him in November doing Mephistopheles in Faust, and he's now on the Piper Artist roster. And so that's for me what really makes it special, is to be able to take a young singer like that and know that I've made a positive mark on their career and can help them move forward.
Mitchell Piper, you've taught me a lot today. You've taught us a lot. Even though I knew some of the stuff, I was happier hearing it out of your mouth for audiences to learn. And because there are so many people, you're one of them, in our opera world who make it work. And without the likes of you, who are not necessarily seen by the public, we would not have opera, plain and simple. So I appreciate what you do. And I thank you.
No, I thank you too, Fred. It's been an enjoyable afternoon.